This is the new Sony RX1R Mark III, an incredibly polarizing little camera that has kind of gotten the world a little bit up in a fit of sorts. But today, let's check it out, compare it to a few other cameras that I've used in the category, and figure out what are kind of its pros and cons. Now, this is on loan to me from Sony. I'm literally packing this up and sending it back the moment that I click to stop recording this video. They're not paying me, no money changed hands, any of that kind of stuff. And they're obviously not seeing this video before I publish it or anything like that. Now, I'm on kind of like the second wave of people that have gotten this camera. So you've definitely, if you've been interested in it, you've seen a few reviews and videos about it. I'm not going to go over every little spec or every little thing about this. This camera to me has been something that I've had for a little bit over a week, and I'm going to give you my perspective on it as someone who owns a lot of these kind of like daily bring around cameras. I also brought it to a wedding and took a bunch of portraits and things like that with it as well. So you're going to get the opinion of a working photographer as well as someone who has young kids and likes to travel and do things with them. And yeah, I have a lot of experience with a lot of other cameras like this. Now, there are two things about this camera I think that stand out more than any other. First of all, it's the size. This thing is legitimately really small. If you were able to somehow shave down this lens to be about half the size, this would be like an old school, like early 90s kind of point and shoot size. It is very small, very compact. The lens sticks out a little bit more than something like an X100, X106, and I might as well just grab it. So you can see that this has a little filter adjustment thing, and then I have an actual filter on here. But as far as like the depth to the camera, it's still really small, but that's the only thing right here is this lens that's protruding to make it not pocketable. I wouldn't also say that the X106 is necessarily pocketable, but if this had a much smaller lens, it would be closer to being able to like kind of like you could probably jacket pocket it, but it's not going to be like a Ricoh GR series small or anything like that. But as far as the body goes, the actual body of this camera is even smaller than the X106. So that is definitely giving you some idea of how ultra compact this thing is. Now, as the size is probably like, I think one of its biggest proponents, one of the biggest things that's really amazing about it is the size. I'm going to end up hitting on that multiple times through this review, so I'm not going to just sit on that right now for forever, because the second thing about this camera that is a lot more difficult to swallow is going to be the price. Right off the bat, $5,100 is a lot of money. A lot of people have said that that's actually making the, like the Leica Q series even feel more palatable. It's even more than the Fujifilm GFX 100 RF at a medium format camera, but I don't think that those cameras are necessarily in the same range as this camera for a few reasons. Obviously, they're in the same category, but I totally understand why people will pick this camera up over some of those other ones. All that being said, I'm not going to give the price just like a complete pass here. I get that the original was also a lot of money. I get that if you take out the tariffs and you convert to the Canadian price and stuff, that it's almost the same price as it was like 10 years ago when you account for inflation and all those different things. I get it. But I do think that positioning this above $5,000 is a tough ask, especially considering how good of other cameras you can buy for that price tag. You're getting into like flagship camera pricing. And again, I get all the arguments. I get that this has an internal, like an inbuilt lens. I get that it's really small. But if someone's telling you that this is a logical camera, it's an illogical choice. Again, people are going to compare it to an A7CR. They're going to compare it to every other small compact thing on the market. And if you're going by a value proposition alone, this camera is just probably not going to win almost any time. But there are a lot of places and a lot of scenarios where I think it does win. And I think probably a little bit more of where I'm going to focus on in this review. So if you are looking at this and going $5,100, it's just too much. It's absurd. I will never pay that. Then, I mean, join the massive list of other people that probably aren't going to pay this either. And personally, if you want my full take on this, If this came in at like $4,000, like I probably would have maybe sold a few things and purchased it. And I'll probably say that again at the end of this thing. But if it was a lot more feasible for me to purchase this camera, I definitely would. And I understand why they priced it why they did. All that stuff. Like I've gone through the ringer internally and I've seen people do it externally on the price of this camera. But it is what it is. For the rest of this, I'm going to try to focus less on that and more on what the camera actually is and what it does and all those kind of things. Now, this tiny camera, as far as like a photo sensor specifically, it has that 61 megapixel sensor that I have in the A7R5 that they probably put in the Leica Q3, the Q43. It's probably the same one that's in my Leica M11. It's just one of the best photo sensors that has ever been made. The amount of dynamic range, the detail, all those things. If you have a mechanical shutter or a leaf shutter of some kind, you are going to get amazing image quality. And the fact that this has that 61 megapixel sensor in this tiny body is something that is really impressive. The other thing that a lot of people kind of have clamored about with the like Q series is, I get like 35 millimeters is just like a really good all-around focal length. It doesn't do anything really well, but it is just that middle ground for a lot of people. So all the people that wanted like a Leica Q to be a 35 millimeter, that's kind of why this thing exists. 35 is just a great all-around focal length. It's a great travel focal length. And this thing is pretty small and lightweight and compact, even for the lens size. So giving you a 35 millimeter f2 in this tiny little form factor is a really nice little thing. I've definitely carried this around, brought it just most of the places that I've gone in the last week or so. And I actually really like the rendering. I think that a lot of people are going to be bummed that they didn't update this lens. I don't think that I have any real issues. I didn't have any issues with the focusing. I know that the lens motors and things are the same ones that they made forever ago, but in no point in my actual usage was this too slow or anything like this. I think that they have added all of the new algorithms and AI focusing everything that Sony does, and the lens generally has been up to snuff on anything I've ever made with it so far. So while it's not perfectly silent like some of the other, GMs and things like that, and you can definitely feel when it focuses, it's still far beyond a lot of the other lenses and things in the category. And because it has all of Sony's algorithms and things, I just haven't missed focus on anything in all of the, probably 1,000+ images that I've taken this. None of the focus has been because of the camera. It's only because of user error. I will also say that while I might not be shooting f2 for landscapes or something with this lens, it's done really well. I think that there is a lot of sharpness in this lens. And sure, in the corners, things start to fall off. But I think that what's a kind of bonus about this lens and this camera in general is that it's actually using an older lens design. Like the Sonar Zeiss design is pretty legendary, and it's kind of like a really old design in general. And I think that it honestly renders things really well and in a really interesting way that you wouldn't necessarily expect to get out of a Sony camera in 2025. So while, again, it's a surprising move for them to put this old lens into a new camera for them, I'm kind of glad they did it. Now, this thing is definitely not perfect, even for as many of the things that I do like about it. First of all, it does take this really tiny little viewfinder, and it's one of those things where it's basically the same viewfinder that's in the A7CR, and where you're just using it by itself on its own. You pull it up to your face and you use it, and it's fine. Like, it's not great. You're not getting like a luxury experience out of it, but it works. It's okay. If you're using it alongside another camera with a much better viewfinder, that's when you start going like, oh man, I kind of wish this thing was bigger. But does it work? Yes. I will say another thing that I ran into multiple times when I was photographing my kids or even during the wedding is there is no flip LCD screen here. It would have been really nice, and I would have definitely taken a slightly wider, thicker body, if it was just ever so slightly thicker, to be able to pop this out and just have a waist level kind of like articulation. I don't need it to flip out. I don't need to do any of those things, but just like that little 90-degree articulation would have been really, really nice on this camera. I get why they did it. I think that from the press briefing that I got and things, that their goal in general was to just make this as small as humanly possible. And they obviously did that at the detriment to some other things. So it's not the decision I necessarily would have made, but I understand that that is kind of the direction they were going in here. Another thing that I would have really appreciated is we have a little scroll wheel here, and I wish there was a front scroll wheel, not necessarily even to change the aperture, because I am the kind of person that actually does like to change it on the lens, but I really like being able to directly access all three parts of the exposure triangle together. And since the top dial here is a mode dial and the second dial is an exposure compensation dial, it would have been really, really nice to either have a front thing here to change your shutter speed and maybe have the back one be your ISO, or to have this particular dial be something that if, you know, in manual, it's using the ISO, and then when you're in, let's say, aperture priority or something like that, then it can switch back to an exposure compensation thing of sorts. But it's one of the things that I have that dial on my Sony Alpha cameras to be ISO. And so it's just another one of those, like, you're slightly remapping your brain to not do that. And like, I have to click this back button, rule the scroll wheel. It's not like the biggest thing in the world, but it's just one of those small little steps that I think that if they could have made this back corner scroll wheel be kind of whatever you want it to be, that would have been a nice thing. Or if they just would have added a scroll wheel on the front, also could have been really helpful. Now, I will go kind of against the trend in a way, and one of the things that a lot of people are really kind of frustrated about is the fact that there's no IBIS. I'm not the person that thinks that IBIS is necessary in every camera. Is it nice? Yes. But do I have a Leica M11 that doesn't have IBIS? Yes. Do I have a Hasselblad 907X that doesn't have IBIS? Also yes. Are both of those premium luxury cameras that don't have IBIS? Yes. Have I ever been in a situation with either of those cameras in a professional environment where I've been like, oh no, I can't get the photo I need to make with these tools because it doesn't have IBIS? No. So would it have been nice to have in this? Yes. Do I need that? Is it a prerequisite for a camera? Would it be a make or break thing in this camera at all to have it or not? No. Now, one of the things I think that they really should have done that they didn't do, especially at this price point, is find some way to have some sort of redundant or backup storage in this. I get why they didn't, because they don't have to in this particular segment of camera. Most cameras in this segment don't have internal storage or some other type of storage. I would have really loved to have even like 256 gigs, 512 would have been amazing, even 128 at bare minimum, to have some sort of internal storage. That's one of the things I have on my Leica M11. It does not have 2 card slots, but I put the 18 megapixel small JPEGs onto the internal storage, and with wedding stuff, I never run out of that. And then I put all the RAWs onto the actual SD card. That way I have some sort of redundancy, which worst case scenario, the card corrupts or whatever. And then I at least have semi-high megapixel JPEGs that will work. I can deal with them. It's not going to be ideal, but it would work. I would have loved to have something like that on this. The other option that I think that they should have looked into, if at all possible, again, it might have been something that they would have had to lengthen the body out. They would have had to find some sort of space for it. I get that. But one of the things that I feel like is really interesting is on the Nikon ZF, it has an SD card, and then next to that SD card slot, it has a micro SD card. So it's another way that the camera, you're going to limit some things. You probably can't record in different modes. It might be difficult. You might have to have like a V90 or V60 micro SD card. It might have some limitation. But the fact that, again, this is like a premium thing, I think that a lot of wedding photographers specifically and other photographers that have a good Sony workflow would have been more inclined to buy this camera had it had some sort of redundancy in there. Now, the thing that I do with cameras that don't have any sort of backup is I use a card that is far beyond the capacity of what I will shoot on it. I will make sure that I will never run into a buffer. I've learned that can be an issue. But then I also use just like a massive card, and I do not take it out. If I'm using anything that is a single card slot camera in a professional environment, that camera will probably have a V60 1 terabyte SD card in it, and that will live in the camera. It will never come out. I will import and export or whatever photos directly from the camera to my hard drives without ever taking that out, because one of the biggest ways that you're going to run into issues is either when you fill up a card all the way and there's no more space on the card for files to go, that can corrupt things, but then also just taking the card in and out and just putting physical wear and tear on it is something that can be an issue with your cards. So again, that's my kind of way around it. Again, I understand why they didn't, but I really, really do think that they would sell more of these to professionals if this had had some sort of redundancy in it. It would just be a much more compelling option that way if they had actually given you a way to make it more of a pro camera in a way. One of the things that a lot of people have talked about, and rightly so, totally get it, is the idea that why would you buy this when you could just buy an A7CR? And if you've looked at my channel, I've made plenty of versions and videos on the A7CR because I think that is a really, really cool camera. My problem ended up being that I had the A7R5, I have an A9 III, I have a Nikon ZF in here, I have the X100 VI. I just have so many cameras that are in between different categories that I found that the A7CR for me was redundant. Where I think that things start to make a lot more sense is if you're looking at the RX1R Mark III next to something like the A7R5, and you're seeing that like actually most of the internals on this that matter, like the sensor, the processor, the AI processing chip, all that kind of stuff are actually the same between these two cameras. That's when you start to go, oh, cool. I think that this could be a really cool combo for somebody. When you add the A7CR, but you do see where it kind of like goes down into that. I think that for me, the A7CR wasn't enough of a difference between itself and the A7R5 to warrant me keeping, because I just had too much redundancy. I had too many other things like that, so I ended up selling it. But I think that this gap between the A7R5 and then the RX1R Mark III is, especially when you look at them, you're like, oh, okay, cool. I can totally see where, especially if you have a really good workflow, if you are someone that's in the Sony ecosystem, you can go, oh my gosh, my pro camera, which is actually cheaper than this camera, does all these amazing things that I really like. I really like my workflow with it. I really like the photos that I get out of it. I really like all the stuff. But I also want a personal camera. I also want a camera that I can carry around. I can use it for photo scouting things. I can use it hiking. I can use it in all these other scenarios. One thing I really liked using this during was like cocktail hour at a wedding. It's much, much easier instead of carrying around this to carry this around and photograph kids and photograph people just getting drinks and chatting and stuff. It just seems a lot more like, again, when you put up this little thing to your face, it's so much less intimidating than when I walk up with this guy to your face. It is one of those things where this makes a lot of sense. I know a lot of people do that same thing with the like a Q system and the Q2 and the Q3. This is still a lot smaller than a Q camera, and by a fairly significant amount. I think that one of the biggest things about this, though, as long as you like the focal length and all that other stuff, is just the pairing into an ecosystem that you are already very familiar with. You're not needing new presets. You're not needing new anything, really. It's going to fall directly into the ecosystem that you already have, and the continuity between your personal work, your professional work, all that kind of stuff is just so much more seamless than if you were adding another sensor and another camera brand, another app, all that kind of stuff into this. And I think that is a big plus that I don't think a lot of people are thinking through necessarily. Just the fact that you don't have to tweak things. You can take photos on both of these in the same time frame, and it's going to give you the exact same thing out of the camera. It's just one of those things where it's like a huge quality of life improvement. in the back end of things to have the same sensor, the same profiles, the same everything on the two cameras. I will say as well, I wish that they would have been able to use the regular FC100 batteries that the other cameras do. That would have just been another really nice continuity thing. I totally understand why they didn't, considering that these batteries are very, very different in size. So if you're looking at the difference in batteries, like this one is about double. Let's see, 1500 versus 2280. So actually not that far off. You're 11.1 watt hours versus 16.4. And actually, to be fair, this is an aftermarket one. I'll put the link in the description if you are looking to buy this camera, because there are tons of these. I got a 2-pack with a USB charger for like $21 or something. So batteries aren't necessarily concerned, and it is a big upgrade over the first version of this, but it is kind of just a little bit of a bummer because they technically could have fit it in here, but that would have been really tough. And again, they made the decision not to make the battery or the camera in general, the body, bigger. I understand why they did it. It would have been nice to not have to carry different types of batteries, different types of chargers, all that stuff, but c'est la vie. I think for me, the price really is the only real deal breaker outside of one other thing. One of the things I think I was most disappointed about is the fact that there's just like no weather sealing. There's no weather sealing, there's no weather rating. From what I've heard, the biggest kind of like issue here and the biggest part of the camera that could be an issue would be the hot shoe and where the kind of like smart adapters and things go into it. So if you do get this camera, I would highly suggest keeping the little hot shoe cover on here and then like putting it in your pocket if you're going to use a flash, which I did with this camera, but making sure that you're replacing it, because again, that's probably going to be the biggest spot where you could run into some issues. But I think that's probably my biggest gripe, again, outside of the price, is the fact that like you want to have an everyday camera be one of those like go anywhere, do anything kind of cameras. And the fact that it just doesn't have any sort of actual weather sealing where so many of the other cameras do, including the A7CR, I really wish that that would have been something they could have fixed in this camera. All that to say, my last little slight, not like a gripe or anything, but my kind of wish is I wish they would have made this version like an RX1R Mark III, and then just an RX1 Mark II or whatever, and just made this same camera, kind of like they did with the A7CR and the A7C2. I think that if they made a version of this that was like I don't know what the gap between the pricing is, but let's say they made this camera with the A7 IV sensor, that 33 megapixel sensor, and made it like $4,000 instead of $5,100. I think they would have sold a ton of these. Photographers generally don't necessarily need 60 megapixels, and especially for an everyday camera, I think 33 is a really, really nice sweet spot. And so I'm actually really surprised they didn't come out with two versions of this camera. And I think that this camera would have gotten significantly less hate and just general vitriol in the community if there had been an option to purchase a lower like tiered version, because I definitely am probably not going to buy this camera at $5,100. If it goes on sale or some used ones start coming up in like the $4,000 range, that's probably where my spot of going, okay, I'll think about it is going to be, because I really like this camera. I really like the size, and it's one of those things where I really like how small it is. And it's one of those things where I can bring it with me. I don't feel weird about bringing it to dinner. I don't feel weird about bringing it on bike rides. I would bring this to baseball games. I would bring this all over the place in some areas in the same way that I bring the X100 VI. But I like the rendering out of this better than the X100 VI. I like the autofocus better than the X100 VI. And I like the files on this better than the X100 VI. So there's a lot that I would really like out of this. But at the price point that is almost 3x what the X100 VI is, it's kind of hard for me to justify selling that and then paying 3 times as much for something like this. But if there was a A7 IV, A7C2, whatever version of this that was less, and then especially on the used market brings it down to like maybe $3,500, $3,300, $3,200, you know, like that's when it starts to get really, really palatable. And I think they would have sold a significant amount more. So do I think that this is like absurd? in that it's really small. Yeah, I love it. I would 100% buy one of these if it was cheaper. It's not. And I think that, again, if the prices come down, if their resale value is lower, blah, blah, blah. Like, and that's the same thing I'll say about the Q series. Like, I've never purchased a Q series because I think the value proposition to me specifically hasn't reached the point where I'm willing to spend that amount of money. I will say it's the same for this. But is it a camera that I would really, really want and fills a hole that I personally would use quite a bit? Absolutely. So let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Is this thing worth it to you? Do you think that if they would have made an A7 IV version, they would have sold more? Do you think that if they priced it lower, they would have sold a lot more? Is this something that's valuable to you? Let me know. And if you want to see my video on the A7CR, you can do that up here. Check out my video on the A7R5 up here, and I'll see you in one of those.